We are grateful to have you joining us for today's Fighting Hate from Home webinar, where we're discussing mayors on the front lines against COVID-19. For today's call, ADL CEO and National Director Jonathan Greenblatt will be in conversation with Mayors Andy Berke of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Greg Fischer of Louisville, Kentucky. An attorney and former state senator, Andy Berke, was elected mayor of Chattanooga in March 2013. Immediately following his inauguration, he streamlined government with a top-to-bottom reorganization. And since the reorganization, his administration has focused on making Chattanooga streets safer, families stronger, and growing middle-class jobs. Under Mayor Berke's leadership, Chattanooga has taken bold steps to further harness the internet, establishing a technology innovation district in the heart of downtown Chattanooga. In 2015, he was named Municipal Leader of the Year by American City and County magazine. Mayor Greg Fischer, a businessman and entrepreneur, was elected Louisville's 50th mayor in 2010 and was sworn in for a third four-year term in January of 2019. Since taking office, Mayor Fischer has pursued three top goals: making Louisville a city of lifelong learning, a much healthier city, and an even more compassionate community. He also serves as the Vice President of the U.S. Conference of Mayors and was named a Public Official of the Year by Governing Magazine and one of America's Most Interesting Mayors by Politico in 2017. And at this time, it's my pleasure to turn the call over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Deb. Hello and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. The COVID-19 panic has taken a significant toll on people and local governments across the country. The scale of this crisis is really unprecedented, testing hospitals and healthcare systems, businesses of all shapes and sizes, schools and universities, and it has pushed local economies and public infrastructure to the edge. Indeed, at the municipal community level, the consequences of the pandemic are being felt acutely in our nation's cities more than probably any other locus. In many ways, mayors are on the front lines of the pandemic, tasked with finding solutions to some of the most challenging side effects of this deadly virus. First, due to the population density of urban environments, cities have seen some of the worst outbreaks of COVID-19. And minorities, immigrants, and the economically disadvantaged, who often live deep in these urban areas, are disproportionately affected by the virus. Number two, mayors are facing a myriad set of almost unprecedented challenges: crippled local budgets, the prospect of public sector layoffs, ensuring that social distancing is being enforced, dealing with schools that are closed and children who are home. Three, some are also facing unique challenges that none of us could have predicted: overflowing morgues and ensuring that those in the greatest need, like senior citizens or children, the unemployed or the homeless, have access to desperately needed public services, which again are being stretched in ways we couldn't have predicted. And number four, thrown into this mix is a new challenge, one that we haven't seen in recent memory in our public life: the active blaming and scapegoating of minorities, particularly members of the Asian American community, by elected officials literally at the highest level. Some cities have actually had to contend with anti-lockdown rallies and protests, which may be the product of frustrated citizens, but often are exploited by anti-government activists, anti-vaxxers, and even white supremacists, and other people pushing conspiracies and threatening even worse. At ADL, we've got a vested interest in our nation's cities. We have a long history of working closely with mayors and local authorities through our 25 regional offices distributed across the United States. In 2017, in response to the disturbing displays of hate that we saw at that violent Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, ADL partnered with the U.S. Conference of Mayors and announced our joint plan to fight extremism and bigotry and to promote justice and equality that we called the Mayor's Compact. More than 300 mayors from across the country pledged to implement that plan. And I've had the good fortune of getting to know Greg Fischer through his involvement in the U.S. Conference of Mayors, as he participated in our Communities Against Extremism program that we held to look at, after Charlottesville, how could our communities come together. So it's a privilege for me to have him here today, to meet Mayor Andy Berke. Two of you have been on the front lines of fighting COVID-19, and welcome to you, and thank you for joining us. I've got a bunch of questions for you, and I know we're going to get questions from our audience, who's always very active and engaged. But I just want to start it out. Just give us a sense, if you will, each of you, about what your cities are facing. What's the state of play on the ground? Give us a sense, if you will, about what's happening in your communities.
Okay, well,
Andy, start with you.
Yeah, sure. So let me start by saying thanks so much for inviting me to be on this. ADL has been an incredible partner for us in our Council Against Hate, which we started a few years ago. I was very lucky to participate with you in St. Louis as we talked about overcoming extremism. This is an important issue, and we're happy to be associated with you. And then I'm always happy to be on a panel with my friend Greg Fischer, because I'll just tell you, nobody does this job better than Greg Fischer. So in the middle of the conversation, if I just stop talking and just listen to what he's saying, you'll understand that I'm doing that so I can learn something. This is an unprecedented crisis in American cities. We're really facing three huge issues. Number one is there's a global pandemic that's affecting the health of our neighbors, people we care about and love. There is an economic stoppage that goes far beyond recession or depression, where we have just absolutely just stopped our economy in place. And therefore there are people who are not, not working, looking for their next meal, struggling to pay their rent. And then the third piece I'll say, which is also important, is that we have this real crisis of spirituality, where there's a mental health component to this. A lot of our residents are worried, they're scared, they don't know whether to go out. And so trying to deal with all three of those at the same time is really difficult. On top of that, here we had an extreme tornado. And so if you just think about the on-the-ground mechanics, we had a nursing home that was destroyed. And so in the middle of the night on Easter Sunday, we were evacuating residents from a nursing home in the middle of a COVID-19 crisis, having to get PPE to everybody, figure out where nursing home residents were going to go. The complexity of this is incredible. And so we're really trying to build the airplane as we're flying it in all these pieces. And you can't let anyone down, because then the other two will be affected as a result.
Greg?
Thank you, Mayor Berke. It's great to be with Mayor Berke as well, one of the great progressive mayors in the country. You know, we mayors have a fan club of each other. It's because Jonathan, when you described our job, I'm thinking to myself, what kind of crazy person wants to have a job like that? But if you like to help people, and if you like to be part of a solution, and you like to see human potential to flourish, that's how we define compassion in our city. There's nothing better, and it's an honor to be in a position like this, even with all the difficulties that Mayor Berke just described. And I'll throw another one in the midst of all these crises. We had an officer-involved shooting that led to the tragic death of a young Black woman that has re-traumatized the Black community, not just in our city, but around America, and all of the historic inequity between power, between communities of color and law enforcement. So it's a lot. You know, you have all this going on. You've got the anxiety and depression that can come out of that Mayor Berke talks about. And then you have the reality of, okay, well, we got to keep going forward. I mean, that's the way of nature. That's the way of humanity, with our resilience and the innovative nature that we have seen. And I would add one other element, or maybe expand on the mental health aspect that Mayor Berke talked about, and that's just in the broad category of human services. So when you think about public health crisis, a fiscal crisis, and then how do you help people that need it the most? If there's anything good that comes out of this pandemic, I just pray we redesign America with the structures that we have and the systems that we have, so that family supporting wages are the standard, that everybody has housing and healthcare and food security, these kind of basics that as a nation we should look at each other and be disgusted that's not the case in the wealthiest nation on the face of the earth. We need to redefine what wealth means, and not just in terms of taking care of ourselves, but how we interact with each other as well. And I'm hoping, we've certainly seen that here in Louisville, more empathy toward people that don't have the means to live. 40% of Americans could not get by on a $400 emergency before the pandemic has revealed all of these inequities. And when people talk about living paycheck to paycheck, boy, has that been under stark relief. So empathy towards people's basic needs and how in this country we should be able to provide that. I mentioned our officer-involved shooting. Empathy toward communities of color that have been historically discriminated against, so that they can understand, white America in particular, and white Louisville specifically, can say, you know, what is the source of all of this frustration? Why don't I know that history? How would I feel if I was in somebody's shoes in that regard? So if we can be the optimist that you have to be with ADL or to be a mayor, you can see a better future coming out of this. But in order to do that, we need to be much more radically constructive. We have worked on these issues all along. Most everybody on this call, I know Jonathan, you have, I know Mayor Berke has, but somehow we've got to figure out a way to flip that switch so that the kind of incremental progress we've had at best is no longer sufficient. And we see this as an opportunity for breakthrough.
Hear, hear. I agree with much of what you said. In particular, your opening comment is funny, because when people say to you, when you hear all the things you're facing, you'd be crazy to have that job. I get that about my job all the time too, dealing with Nazis and white supremacists and other kind of crazies. But this is the public service we're all committed to. So talk to me a little bit about, I'm curious, you know, we were speaking before the webinar got started about the state of play in your states, let alone your cities. Talk to us a little bit about how you think about the fragile local economy and reopening, or if you're already open, how you're dealing with that. I know there are many mayors who are struggling with this. You know, I live in New York and our town is still closed. So how do you think about the reopening process? Can we talk about that just for a minute?
Greg, you want to go on?
Go ahead, Andy. Why don't you
Okay.
start each one of these things, so then we'll just.
Okay, all right. So here in Tennessee, there's been a little bit of publicity because the governor and I had a little bit of disagreement about how we were to reopen the economy, and there's been a lot of back and forth about the role of the state versus the city. We had put together a plan for the reopening of our community. At the last minute, the governor decided to say that no city mayor could control those levers after we had been one of the earliest cities in the country to close. And as of May 1, Chattanooga which is the fourth largest county in the state, we had 1.6% of all the cases in the state. So we had a very good result. And unfortunately, right now, our cases are climbing quickly. So we're in a position where as of this Friday, restaurants will be at full capacity. Shops will be at 100% capacity. Most everything is open other than the extremely large events. So let me just say two things about it. Number one is public health and economic security go hand in hand. We will not be able to reopen our economy truly unless the public health piece is secure. And what we're seeing right now is that it's not. You know, restaurants, we can say that they have 100% capacity, but restaurants operate on extremely low margins, the same with our retail shops. And if 30 or 40 or 50% of the people decide, you know what, we're not going to participate in the economy because we're too worried about the public health piece, then those places aren't going to survive no matter what politicians say. So we have to get this public health piece right. And the second piece, as a local leader, now that that issue had been taken out of our hands, we spent a lot of time working with the community about best practices. The governor, when he opened, also made no mandatory pieces to how you open, so there's no public health protections. So we run several webinars every week for different industries like childcare or retail shops or restaurants, and we can go on, and even houses of worship about how you reopen safely. I'll just say this again, if we don't get the public health piece right, then we're gonna face an even greater dismantling of our economic development. Chattanooga, according to Forbes, was predicted to have the #1 increase in new jobs in 2020. We're a long way away from that, but we can do substantial damage if we don't really concentrate on this public health piece over the next several months.
So for comparison purposes then, our restaurants open Friday at 1/3 capacity. So that's the first step. And our retail opened up yesterday. Healthcare outside of COVID related stuff opened up 2 weeks ago. So we're just starting to emerge. Now, Louisville's a city of about 800,000 people. We're right on the border of Indiana. The Ohio River is between us and Indiana. Indiana went into their stay-at-home orders about 10 days after us and came out of them about 10 days before us. The death rates in Indiana are 4 times those in Kentucky. So these decisions matter. Fortunately, we have a new governor in Kentucky as of this past December, Anti-Fischer, who's done a really measured job toward the reopening. He and I get along very, very well. The prior governor, that would not have been so much the case, and I would have had the same kind of conflict that Mayor Berke is talking about, and most every mayor in Tennessee that I talked to as well, by the way. So that's provided some alignment. So I think there's so many things that we can learn as a country, but one of them is the impatience that Americans have. And some of the impatience is fueled by a real need to be able to make a living, to put food on the table. I mean, that speaks more to our social compact, which is a longer term discussion to have. So where we're at as a city right now is, how do you learn how to manage to live with the virus until we get to a vaccine? So for us, it's a 4-part square, if you will. So number 1, how do you loosen the faucet up so that you're gradually reopening your economy, not just whip it right open where everything's open all at once, but you got to go slow. So that's the phase we're in right now. Number 2, is your testing capacity for COVID adequate so that you can be doing systematic testing throughout your community on a statistically valid basis with focus on vulnerable populations so that you know whether or not the virus is starting to break out again? Number 3, do you have the contact tracing capacity in place in your public health department so that if the virus does put out, that you can box it in through quarantining people and providing food, medicine, housing, if need be, to them so that the virus does not spread throughout the community. And then number 4th, and probably the most important, is what is the level of citizenship that will take place during the virus relative to public health requirements? So are we still social distancing? Are we wearing face masks so that we can do kind of those blunt force measures to make sure the virus doesn't spread as much as you could? So think of that as 4 parts. It should be a harmonious, beautiful dance when it all works together well. And if it doesn't, we're going to have to pull back because we don't want people to lose confidence in our ability to reopen the economy, because that'll take us back even further than we were before. And I really fear that on a national level, the lack of a federal response to recognizing this danger that was coming to our country. We had months of notice, and to deny that is super abdication of responsibility. To defund basic departments that protect us from this as a country, the department that oversees pandemics, is just mind-boggling to understand why you would even do something like that. And now we have hundreds of experiments going on in the country, from cities to states that are reopening in different ways with different demographics. So we're going to be much smarter in a couple months by looking at these various experiments. And I just hope that they're not too deadly. That's the reality of the situation we're in right now. And mayors like Mayor Berke and myself are just, we're kind of on our own to figure it out from the ground level up. And the immediacy of that being a mayor is very apparent. People know where to find us, and we're happy for that, but it requires immediate action now.
It is. I mean, I agree with that. It's fascinating to hear what both of you had to say. I certainly agree with this point about the abdication of leadership at the federal level. I mean, it's bananas. The fact that we knew this was coming, like a freight train coming down the tracks, and didn't do more. And, you know, it's cost lives. It's really quite unfortunate. But I'd love to ask you, I mean, I know we at ADL had to pivot pretty dramatically, again, with offices around the country, people worried. It's running the organization from home. How have you had to, you know, as mayors, I'd love to hear as executives, some of the most complicated challenges you faced in trying to manage and trying to lead in an environment where no one's around. Like, what has that been like? And like, you know, Andy, I know that Chattanooga has its own sort of public internet service, which seems like quite an interesting thing in terms of providing or filling that digital divide. Has that helped you to manage and lead? How have you both dealt with it as this situation as leaders?
Well, I have to do a little real estate announcement for everybody during this. You know, Chattanooga has the fastest, cheapest, most pervasive internet in the world. It's a fiber optic network that goes to every single home and every single business in a 600 square mile area. That means that nobody, no neighborhood, no one in our city misses the connection that gives them up to 10 gigabit per second. So to give you an idea, like if you have a regular cable connection that might be 25 up and down, you know, Chattanooga's is 10,000. So that definitely puts us in a position to talk about what digital equity is like, which has been a huge focus of ours over the last few years. So everybody on this call, you know, we'll email you a little brochure. You can come move to Chattanooga, and then Louisville would be a nice backup for you. I think it's been a real struggle, I think, for us to pivot from this world that we thought we were in, which was, as I said, Chattanooga was really set to take off. We've had a great few years. We were set to really hit that next level. Louisville's about twice as big as us, as our county, to give you an idea. And we were on the cover of every magazine over the course of the last couple of years. So we're hitting that sweet spot. And instead, we've had to pivot to a world that is really where the social safety net that Greg was talking about is just strained to the max, and you're worried about people falling out, where businesses, particularly those who have no credit worthiness and are struggling to pay their bills, they don't have the cash because there's no revenue coming in. We're trying to help particularly those owned by people of color in some of our lowest income census tracts. How do we keep those going? And as a leader, I think trying to help everybody get to the right mindset was a big piece of where we started, especially because, as Greg was talking about, we'd had this notice, but our leaders, when we started taking it seriously, our federal government still wasn't taking it seriously. So getting everybody in the room, which was where I started back on March the 13th, and telling everybody, this is what's about to happen, and here's where we're going with this. I think that was piece one. And then even over the last few weeks, what I've been preaching to everybody is we need to move from emergency to urgency. So we were in this world where we were regulating everybody. We were thinking about it on a daily and weekly basis. And we're starting to move to this world that says we can't just be making decisions on a week-to-week or day-to-day basis, because this is going to be with us for a long period of time. You know, people are on the edge. The world is getting shaken and they're falling off. That's not going to be a one-day problem. This is where we are for the near future. And so we've got to really think about how we sustain this social safety net piece, where the federal government, as Greg was saying, has just abandoned us in so many different ways. And we're the front. We're not the front line. We're the front line. We're the medium line. We're the back of the line. And we've got to solve these problems for people over the course of the next few months. And I think trying to lead that way over this screen, we're all adjusting to it. But I will say, and I bet Greg will agree with me, it's been much easier than I thought it would be. I thought it would be extremely difficult, but people are doing their work. They're excited to help people. They understand the stakes, and it really has been a much smoother transition than I thought it would be.
Great.
Yeah, no, and I agree with Mayor that people have risen to the occasion. I mean, I think when you're looking for hope amidst darkness here, there's been so much hope and so much beauty and joy in our city in this really dark time. So I'm very appreciative of that. And we, being in the middle of the country, we saw what was happening in Seattle. We knew it was coming toward us. So we were able to start sooner than, let's say, when it hit the nursing home in Seattle or New York and the exponentiality increase there. So very quickly, we took on 3 things to get prepared for it. One was to address the digital inequity issue that Andy referred to. So we knew that we were going to be going to non-traditional instruction with online learning in our school system. So we had about 20% of our 100,000 kids without internet. So we quickly deployed 25,000 Chromebooks out of our schools into the homes, helped them get hooked up on the web. And so our learning instruction online now has not been an issue of inequity. Very grateful for that. We created our COVID relief fund, quickly raised $10 million for that, have helped thousands of families that have been really hit hard by this. And then we created something called Lift Up Loop, which is a morale building virtual town hall that has 4 programs a day, because we wanted people to have a rhythm as we went through this crisis and people's lives got turned upside down. These rhythms are important. Half of America is reporting some type of anxiety, depression, some type of mental health problem right now. So we have to attend to that. Mayor Berke spoke to the need for that earlier. So those 3 things helped put us in pretty good stead. And then we're pretty effective at taking on big problems and solving them. And we've done that with the virus. But then, as I mentioned, then you had another kind of crisis engulf our community with this officer-involved shooting where a woman named Breonna Taylor was killed in that. And so and then we had a national media person or national blogger associated that with Ahmaud Arbery's tragedy in Brunswick, Georgia, and said, well, see, it's the same thing. It's not the same thing. But nevertheless, the trauma that comes out of the killing of a Black American when law enforcement involved in our country is a very real issue that you can just not sweep under the rug. So having that type of turmoil over the last 10 days or so in our community has added a whole nother element to dealing with the reality of a city. We're in a better place now. We're hoping that something good's going to come out of that tragedy, but you just can't say, hold on a minute, we're in the middle of a pandemic. That tornado is not going to happen here, or this officer-involved shooting is not going to happen here. We wish we could do that, but it's the nature of having to deal with the reality of running a city.
So I want to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience, as you have a bunch of questions in the chat. At ADL, we're focused on fighting hate, anti-Semitism, racism, all forms of bigotry and intolerance. We've been very alarmed at the rise in anti-Asian sentiment and activity, as well as just an explosion of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, all this around COVID-19. People of Asian descent or Asian ethnicity being harassed and attacked on the street, Jews being targeted and blamed for starting or spreading the virus. It's ugly. And I know mayors are dealing with this. And, we're a very data-driven, evidence-based organization, and we've done some of the research. I know, Andy, you in Kentucky had 29 incidences of white supremacist propaganda in 2018. And last year, the number jumped to 117. And there were almost 24 incidents in Louisville alone. And I know last year that a Hindu temple was vandalized with hateful graffiti. And I know, looking at Chattanooga, Andy, that you had 4 biased incidents last year, including one that was anti-Semitic in nature. I'd love to hear from both of you about how you're dealing with hate being spawned by COVID-19, if you've seen any of it on the ground, and more generally, how you think about this issue from your vantage point as mayors of very pluralistic, diverse communities. Andy, why don't you go first?
Sure. So, hate continues to spread even in the era of COVID-19. let me just give you a couple of examples that are large and small. One is just last weekend, a couple of days ago, the vice president of one of our growing tech companies was fired when the news media was alerted that his Facebook page had pictures of Barack Obama, President Obama, with a noose around his neck. We recently had one of our so-called news sites, which is a local website with right-wing affiliations, published one of their most active columnists published a list of Holocaust jokes. I kid you not about that. And then I'll give you the smallest example, which is, to your point, Jonathan. I get these emails that are talking to me about do something about the quote China virus. And I just remember, you know, because I see these all the time, and a man who my wife and I have gone out to dinner with sent me this email, and just thinking to myself, my gosh, what is going on here? So, you know, we have a Council Against Hate. This was started in response to the domestic terrorism attack we had here in 2015, and then following the Charlottesville incident, we decided to stand up and say, these are not our values. This is not what we believe. And the Council Against Hate, which has been heavily informed by ADL staff and by the research that y'all do, has really helped us to speak out about this on a regular basis. Our steering committee still meets, so they meet virtually. They speak up about this. We understand that in these times, we cannot let hate grow under our noses. And the one thing I wanted to go back to was something that Greg was talking about earlier is the empathy. I think this is a time where we have to have great empathy. You know, we're all wearing masks, but we still have to see each other beyond these masks, and we have to feel for each other. But there are people out there who want to manipulate this situation for their own political or economic benefit to demonize and marginalize communities. And it's incumbent upon all of us to have the structures like the Council Against Hate that over and over again call people out and say what our empathy and true character is.
And in Louisville, I mean, we're super proactive in this area. When I became mayor, I said we're going to have 3 big values that will lead our city: lifelong learning, health, and compassion. And compassion means respect for every human being so that their full human potential is flourishing. So for us, it's an action word, you know, and how if a city where everybody had their full human potential on display and all the beautiful diversity we have with that, what an incredible place that would be to live. So that is not, if you came to Louisville and talked to people about compassion, they wouldn't look at you funny. They'd say, let us tell you what our community is doing in that area. So number 1, always work on that. Number 2, our Center for Interfaith Relations and our Festival of Faiths is now over a quarter century old. It's known as one of the great gatherings in the world every year for an exchange of the beauties of each of our religions around a variety of topics. It could be gender issues, it could be the environment, but it's part of the core of who we are as a community. So when there are acts of hate, and Jonathan, you mentioned the Hindu temple that was defaced about 1.5 years ago. That's a job you and I could have cleaned up in about probably 2 or 3 hours. 500 people show up the next morning to say we won't tolerate this. We had a mosque defaced about 4 years ago. 1,000 people showed up for that. So I mean, these are the demonstrations in the community where we say we will not tolerate this. And one thing that's been so beautiful about the response to this virus has been our first generations, our new Americans, foreign-born Americans that have seized on this through various platforms that we've created as an opportunity for them to demonstrate what it means to them to be an American. So whether it's the translation services, preparation of meals and delivering that to first responders, making masks, our foreign-born community has outperformed our multi-generation community in terms of acts of kindness and compassion. So I use my daily media brief to talk about what it means to be an American and point out to our Pakistani community, our Turkish community, our Bosnian community, goes on and on. And I'm saying, folks, this is what it means to be an American. We help each other. And to see these new Americans exercising their Americanship, if that's a word, has been really inspiring. And I hope it has inspired other folks as well. So that's the way we've got to lean into this. After Charlottesville, you mentioned that, we created something called Lean Into Louisville. We were not going to stand by as a community and allow those putrid displays of hate take place without a response. And my view is, as people learn more about discrimination and the roots of discrimination, there's less discrimination. So Lean Into Louisville has informed our community through big lectures, through tabletop dining, through a variety of things about the roots of hatred, whether it be racism or sexual orientation or country of origin. And those are proactive ways that we can help each and every day. So we've been working on that. We're going to continue to work on it because hate is always out there, isn't it? And it's our job to knock it down.
Hear, hear. Deb, do you want to take some questions from the chat?
Absolutely. So thank you all very much. I think this has given us certainly a lot to talk about, and I'll tell you the chat is very full. I'll try and group some of these questions together so we can cover as many topics as possible with what time we've got left. So the first thing I want to ask you about is the importance of census data. So we've gotten a few questions about how that data affects you and affects your communities on a day-to-day basis. And as part of that, I wonder if you can speak briefly to the size and your relationship with the Jewish communities that you have at home.
Okay, well, I'll start there since my relationship with the Jewish community is pretty tight. So I'm Jewish. My family came to the United States in the early 20th century after being chased out of Lithuania and the Ukraine and the pogroms. I've been president of my synagogue. Let's see, I'm president of my AZA group when I was a teenager. So my family has been a part of the Jewish community here for a long time. And certainly that's given me special insight growing up as a Jew in the South, thinking about issues of hate basically my whole life. In this time that I think has put a whole different level of emphasis on hate, the complete, just destructive language that we see coming from the highest levels of our country. We have banded together as a community, and really, I think, as Greg was talking about, interfaith, tried to make sure that we're discussing this, that it's always on the forefront, and I think that's been a real positive for our community. And at State of the City a few weeks ago, I talked a lot about my faith. I talked about Elijah and what Elijah's lesson of going into the cave. I talked about Passover. So this is part of our everyday life, and I think an important part as a spiritual person myself, and as having a community of people who believe in God and are dedicated to their own worship. On the census piece, the census determines so much about our communities, particularly how much money we get. And in various ways, I think there's close to $1 billion that's just allocated to cities based on census data. And then, excuse me, so close to $700 billion that goes based on that. You've got medical fees and all kinds of other information. And right now, there has been a huge push to tell people like our people of color, particularly our Latinx community, you should be worried about the government getting this information. We saw that particularly last year with some of the desire to put a citizenship question on the census. And so we're spending, I'm sure Greg is too, we're spending a lot of time trying to overcome that feeling of worry, that feeling of distrust, because it will disenfranchise people politically when it comes time to draw districts, but also in terms of how much we're able to receive financially to help people in low-income census tracts if we don't count each and every person.
I won't add anything to the census comments there. The mayor was right on with all those. I would like to add one other civic responsibility, and that's voting. So voting has been disrupted. Many of us are having primaries coming up soon. We've got the general elections, of course, in November, and monitoring the right and the accessibility for us to vote will never be more important, especially in this general election coming up here in November. So we have to be very proactive as to what the possibilities could be to minimize the vote. And so I just will put that in that same kind of category of the census of a civic responsibility. As it relates to our Jewish community here, I was raised in the Catholic tradition. Our Jewish community is an essential part of our interfaith tradition here, and as is the case, I don't think I'm overgeneralizing here in terms of leadership in our community and our interfaith efforts, that our Jewish community is overrepresented in a beautifully positive way. And the outreach from our Jewish community and the partnership with our Muslim community is something that we're really proud of here. Of course, this pandemic, took place during Easter and Passover and Ramadan. And I think a lot of people have reconnected or become even more dependent on their spirituality during this pandemic, just because of the isolated nature of it and the ability to do self-reflection. And I think, at least in my case, that self-reflection leads to thoughts of interdependence. I mean, we are all on here, this earth together. Thomas Merton, who was a famous Catholic monk at the Abbey of Gethsemane, had his famous epiphany here in 1958 in Louisville. And, his vision was, when he was downtown, he just said, if only everyone could see each other the way I see them now, walking around, engaged with each other, walking around shining like the sun, in this metaphor of light in the sun, of goodness that's within each and every one of us, regardless of our faith traditions, regardless of our skin color. That type of ethos is what we try to drive our city on. Judge Louis Brandeis is from Louisville, of course, the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. So everywhere from Judge Brandeis to Muhammad Ali, the Louisville Lip, where his hometown from there. So what a beautiful Jewish Muslim kind of melding, coming together, that talks about the possibilities of America and the possibilities in our cities. And I just think the importance of all of us on this call, and particularly those of us, Mayor Berke and myself, Jonathan and others, to use what I call our secular pulpits to preach, preach about the common human values that we're all born with, I believe, of kindness and compassion and love. And somehow don't let those human values be beat out of us as we grow older. And some people say, oh, that's soft and touchy-feely. No, it is the essence of who we are. We are born with that. So bringing those values alive in everyday life really is the promise of our country and the promise of humanity. And for those of us that have the pulpits to preach on that, we need to do that multiple times a day. Yes, we have to respect our differences, but we have to also celebrate the commonality that we have.
Can I, Deb, before you ask the next question, can I just add, because Greg's getting me all stirred up with his preaching there, but I do want to say that one of the great, I think, undocumented stories of big American cities like ours is the commonality between Jewish leaders and Muslim leaders, and the way that they make common cause on issues like hate throughout, I think, all over America. I have close relationships as a Jewish leader with our Muslim community. The rabbis in Chattanooga do. The local Muslim leaders are as active in the things that we do as anybody. And I do think it's just underreported the way in cities like Chattanooga and Louisville, Jewish and Muslim leaders come together in the great American tradition to really help build their communities.
Thank you both for that. That had the added element of being a little uplifting, which is, I think, something that we could all use a little bit more of these days. So you both spoke about the issues of digital inequality as it relates to education in your communities. Can you speak a little bit to what you plan to do or what you are doing to help curb online hate and online bullying? There have been multiple questions about that, and that's also a priority at ADL in terms of fighting cyber hate. So I'd love to hear from you about your perspectives about what we can do.
Well, so for us, part of our Council Against Hate is devoted to this very issue. There is that seedy underbelly. We brag about our universal internet and high-speed broadband. I'm not going to stop that. At the same time, it allows some of our worst impulses to flourish. And so we have some great reporting mechanisms. We try to, when we need to, we have ways that we get our Chattanooga Police Department involved. But as I said, it is difficult for us to see because much of it is happening in places that I don't go and truthfully don't ever want to go. And then people who are bullied frequently don't feel comfortable coming to us and talking to us about it. And so part of what we're trying to do is make sure that we speak out both in a public setting and in private settings to let people know here's how you can report, talk to us about this so that we can take further action. One of the toughest things I think is just with the way that the internet allows you to self-segment, just finding out about it is as difficult as anything.
And we work with our federal partners, the FBI in particular, on that. But I'd like to mention another aspect of that. The amount of online bullying that is taking place increases all the time. When we take a look at the root cause of some of the violence in our community, especially amongst younger people, we're seeing a higher percentage of young boys of color involved with violent crime, either as homicide victims or homicide suspects. And so much of that traces back to the online presence where they're just, talking some, serious smack and insults at each other to where then when they're not developed intellectually enough to say, look, I'm stepping back from this, they feel like they've got to engage. And that engagement oftentimes leads to violence. So the recognition in the homes of our community about really understanding what your younger kids are doing on the web has never been more important. So that's an area of deep concern for us.
Thank you. Jonathan, maybe you can speak a little bit to what ADL is doing along these lines, and perhaps there are some tools available for these mayors that might be helpful for them.
Well, ADL has certainly been very focused on coming up with strategies to tackle intolerance in communities. And one of the things that came out of that initial Mayor's Compact, we developed partnership with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, were a set of strategies that mayors or first selectmen or other municipal leaders could undertake. Like number one, I think it's critical that elected leaders demonstrate the kind of pluralism and compassion that we've literally heard today from Mayors Fischer and Berke, and start by calling out hate whenever it happens. Period, end of story. Doesn't matter where it started, if there's a political connection to it, you call out, you interrupt intolerance, period, end of story. Number two, anti-bias education in schools. The best thing we can do for the next generation is to inoculate them against intolerance. And I think that's critical. Number three, make sure that law enforcement is adequately trained up to understand what's a hate crime and how to deal with it. They're different than ordinary offenses. They have impacts not just on the victims directly affected, but by the broader community. And therefore the healing process is different as well. So I think making sure that law enforcement's effectively trained up on how to deal with hate crimes, and furthermore, that they're reporting them effectively is really, really important. And then, finally, I think this point that's been made now, we need to recognize that all forms of hate can hurt. So cyberbullying and online harassment typically isn't something you see on a playground or you see in, on a temple or a synagogue like vandalism. And yet, as we move into these our digital lives, and we're all in this work from home environment, right? Where so much of the way that we work, like the way that we shop, like the way that we socialize, is all moved online. We as leaders need to recognize that there is no difference between online and offline anymore, and make sure that we're extending adequate protections and standing with our citizens wherever and whenever they experience hate.
Thank you, Jonathan. And building a little bit on what you just started to do in terms of action, I want to be mindful of our time together, but I'm going to put the question to all three of you. What can an ordinary person do to help make this world a better place? We're seeing all these terrible things happening, certainly all the different inequities. I'd love to hear from all three of you. What are the actions that people can take?
Well, I'll start and say, I think first is there are opportunities for leadership in every community. I know Louisville has, I think Mayor Fischer has sufficiently branded Louisville as a city of compassion, where that's going to be their identity for a long time. And I know for us, we talk about our Council Against Hate, which has been incredibly active. Every city does, or even if there's not one immediately out there, there are ways for you to step up and form part of that. I think being active is number two. Being active in national organizations like the ADL is really important. It's something that my family was active in when I was a kid, and so I think growing up and understanding, this is not supposed to just be a commercial for y'all, by the way. This is actually real. I think that helps you understand kind of what needs to happen in terms of leadership on a larger level. Number three, I think as Greg said, as Jonathan said, making sure that when we see acts of hate, that we speak out, because it is easy for people to just be silent and to feel uncomfortable or worried. And I think having the courage to stand up and speak about these things is critical. And then number four, I will just say, is vote. Vote for leaders who are inclusive. Vote for people who want our communities to see every person succeed. And most of all, don't vote for anybody who marginalizes and I think tears down certain segments of our community. There is just no way that that's a good thing for our country.
Yeah.
And I'd say, number one, find something you're passionate about, right? I mean, life is supposed to be joyful. And I've been blessed. I mean, I work a lot of hours. Most people say that, but I don't feel like I've ever worked a day in my life, because I've always loved what I do and how I can make an impact. So what is it that when you do something, it's like time stands still. It's so enjoyable and you feel so fulfilled. And if you can find that, then you have to take a stand. It's easy in life just to go along to get along. No, not if you're interested in being someone that's going to make the world a better place, or if you're interested in a world of more equity. And then don't hesitate to take on a big problem, because you can solve these big problems one person at a time. And you just can't underestimate the power that you have as a person. And you might think, oh, I'm just one person. You will motivate and inspire scores of people by the very act of you getting engagement. And sometimes it comes from the most unlikely places as well. And that's what is super inspiring to other people when they see somebody doing that. So I would say, learn how to become an activist. And an activist doesn't have to be your stereotype of an activist. It can be that 85-year-old Jewish grandma that's watching this right now. She's a great activist, okay? You don't have to be young to be an activist, but take a stand and make a difference. And I think when we do that, what people see is you're celebrating your full humanity. You're celebrating everything it is that you have to give, and there's no better way to live that when it's designed and aimed toward helping other people.
I mean, really, just remarkable. Thank you for sharing both the thoughts. Let me quickly close with what people can do. Number one, speak out. So when you see hate happen, whether it's on the playground or at the water cooler or I suppose, on the Zoom cooler, because we're all working out from home, or, you know, on Facebook. Flag the comment on Facebook. Report the tweet on Twitter. Say something to that colleague or that neighbor. Again, like, words have an impact and they can escalate into much worse. So every one of us, every one of you, 85-year-old grandmothers and, you know, everyone down, everyone can step up and speak out when you see hate happen, number one. No one should be a bystander. Number two, share facts. Like, avoid the kind of talk radio phenomenon of saying crazy things. Even if some elected officials, I think you know who I mean, tweet lunatic memes. Stick at like things that are fictitious and bizarre. Stick with the facts, stick to the data, know your stuff, don't get emotional, keep it at the level. And number three, so you step up, speak up, share facts, and then, you know, like, you gotta be strong, stay positive. I so admire these two elected officials because they're demonstrating to you in a way that, again, is out of the norm for too many public officials these days, how to be positive, how to be proactive, and don't just stand up for yourself. I mean, this is what, like, at ADL, our mission compels us, and the Jewish faith compels us, that it's not just enough to speak up for yourself, you also need to speak up for the other. Like, that's what we believe. And so being there for other people, being an upstander for those in need, I think it's the greatest calling of all. All right, I just want to thank Andy and Greg so much. Deb, do you want to close us out?
Absolutely. Again, I'll echo Jonathan's thanks, and I'll let you know if my text messages and the Zoom chat are any indication, there are going to be an influx of both of your cities for folks who want to move there. And there's a lot of support for you running for additional office, just in case you wanted to know. So we're incredibly grateful for taking this time. This was really a fabulous conversation, so thank you. And thanks to everyone on the line for joining us. We hope you'll join us again next week when we will be fighting hate from home and addressing anti-Semitism on campus with the CEO of Hillel and other guests. Registration will be hitting your inbox with more information soon. And until then, stay safe and continue to be well. Bye-bye. Thank you.